Welcome back. This is a lesson to introduce some vocabulary that we're going to encounter in the coming weeks. First, let's talk about empiricism, verificationism, and instrumentalism. Empiricism is a view about knowledge. According to empiricists, the primary source of knowledge is perception, and the primary objects of knowledge are the kinds of things that can be known by perception. For example, colors, shapes, and so on. Empiricism is usually contrasted with rationalism, the view that the primary source of knowledge is rational thought, and the primary objects of knowledge are the kinds of things that can be known about by rational thought, including perhaps things like our own thoughts or mathematical truths, and, according to Descartes, our own existence. Aristotle is an example of an ancient empiricist thinker, in contrast to the rationalism of his teacher, Plato. Descartes is our representative modern rationalist, but there were also empiricists like George Berkeley and John Locke in the modern era. By the 20th century, it was widely thought that the sciences ought to be based on empiricist principles. That is, they ought to be based on observation and perception. Hence, these days you often hear people talk about empirical sciences as though that expression were redundant. That is, as though science were by definition empirical. Now, that's a matter for a different class, but we can at least note that traditional rationalists like Descartes were not at all anti-science. You'll recall that Descartes was motivated precisely by the goal of finding rationalist foundations for the sciences. Be that as it may, we've already seen that one kind of objection to the first scientific psychological theories, those based on introspectionist methods, was that they were not sufficiently scientific. The complaint was that introspection, despite its name, isn't a kind of perception after all, but really more like rational reflection. A truly empirical psychology would have to be based on the kinds of observations that can be made by and shared by more than one person, or so the thought goes. A motivation for this idea is that we ought to be able to tell, objectively as it were, whether scientific claims are true or false. In the early 20th century, the proposal was made that scientific claims don't just need to be verifiable because we want them to be, but it's actually a linguistic or semantic requirement that empirical claims be verifiable. Specifically, the suggestion is that verifiability is a criterion for language being meaningful at all. Statements or pseudo-statements that can't be verified are literally meaningless on this view. Verificationism says that claims are only meaningful if they can be checked, that is, verified. Suppose I say it's 70 degrees outside. What does that mean? Well, according to the verificationist view, it means something like, if you look at a thermometer, you'll see that it reads 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Reading a thermometer is a procedure for verifying claims about temperature, that is, for determining the truth of sentences containing the word temperature. I could also say, following Lewis Carroll from Jabberwocky, "'Twas brillig and the slithy toves did gyre and gambol in the wabe." That looks like a sentence that starts out roughly parallel to "It's 70 degrees outside." But the Jabberwocky is nonsense. We have no way to check whether it's brillig today. It's not just nonsense like someone telling you that the moon is made of cheese. The moon is made of cheese is meaningful, there's a procedure for checking, and it's not true. In contrast, there's no way to check whether 'twas brillig, because there's no verification procedure at all associated with brillig. So the expression "'twas brillig" looks like part of a sentence, but it's not. It literally has no meaning at all. It's just another noise I can make, like a burp or a sneeze. Verificationism fell out of fashion for a variety of reasons, not least of which being that it doesn't seem to apply to itself. It's not a logical truth, or true by definition, and it's not clear what procedure you would use to check the truth of a sentence about verification. So the verification criteria is not itself verifiable. But there's another view that's a bit softer than verificationism and doesn't have the same defects. Instrumentalism is a view, especially applied to the scientific terms, that the terms themselves need not refer to anything at all in order to be meaningful. Instead, it's enough for the terms to be tools or instruments for achieving certain practical or empirical results. Think about atoms. If you think about atoms and molecules, you probably think about the drawings in textbooks or the models you built in school. But atoms are not little balls, and atomic bonds are not sticks. Yet those models help us understand and work with different materials. Their value to us lies in the fact that they're tools, that is, instruments that help us do things. Okay, changing gears, let's talk about a different family of terms. The term intentionality is a bit of philosophical jargon for talking about meaning. It's important to distinguish intentionality with a T, the sort we're now discussing, that is, intentionality as aboutness or contentfulness, from two other ideas. The first is what philosophers call intentionality with an S, and it's a feature of some intentional with a T, content, and other things. We're not going to worry about intentionality with an S right now. We're just going to make sure we don't confuse it with intentionality with a T. The second notion we want to not confuse with intentionality as aboutness is intentionality in the sense of deliberateness or purposefulness. This is what we're talking about in everyday conversation when we ask whether I intentionally dropped something or whether it was an accident. Sometimes we drop things on accident, but I can also drop something in order to demonstrate a principle in class, as a way of giving it to my dog, or in order to start a game. Deliberate action, doing something on purpose, is distinct from the contentful states that sometimes cause it, even if we confusingly call them by homonyms. So, back to our special philosophical notion of intentionality with a T as content or aboutness. The term intentionality has the same roots as the term index, as in the index of a book or the index finger. They're things that point at other things. The index, or pointing finger, is directed at the world, and in some sense, the point is about the thing towards which it's directed. Similarly, a simple view of thoughts and language is that they point at the world, and that they're about what they point at. That is, the simple view is that the content of a word is the thing that it points at. The word tree is about trees. Trees are its content or object. So the idea is that items have intentionality when they have meaning, in the sense of content or being about something else. Beliefs and desires are classic examples of intentional states, states with content. Thoughts, words, and symbols are things that have intentional content, and we can also say that systems, such as us, that are capable of having intentional content are themselves intentional, or, as some say, we're intentional systems. In our next reading, True Believers, Daniel Dennett is going to argue that the idea of an intentional system is instrumentally useful. Whether something is an intentional system is a matter of interpretation, according to Dennett. But he also thinks that there's a fact of the matter about whether something is an intentional system, and his criteria may even remind you of verificationist thinking.